Hi, welcome.
Hello.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So we have lots of questions for you today.
I'm frighteningly enormous on the screen. It's quite odd. Yes. I'm going to look at the camera. I can't see myself.
Yeah, it's like a movie theater experience.
Yeah.
So we have a bunch of different questions. I'm going to
just turn this monitor off, actually. It's quite disconcerting. Sorry. I don't like looking at myself while I'm talking. It makes me look shifty-eyed. I'll look at you. I'll look at the camera. It's fine.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start with some very big picture questions about freedom of information, and then we'll get to more specific issues. So one of the topics that I personally find very interesting is the impact of the internet and the impact of expanded information on politics all over the world. And so on the one hand, we have, social media, we have the internet, it's increasing information, it's challenging authoritarian control because it's much harder for authoritarian governments to control the information in the age of the internet. At the same time, you have governments cracking down increasingly on the web all over the world. We're seeing this. And I would just love to hear your perspective of the impact of the internet and social media on authoritarian regimes and the potential for these kinds of communications to spur political change.
Well, I mean, I think the impact is enormous and will continue to be enormous. Certainly, we do see efforts by governments to crack down, but it's actually become a little bit more subtle. I think that governments are aware today that they cannot really control the flow of information. They can't stop people from finding things out. But what they can do is have a chilling effect, particularly on domestic conversations. So for example, in China, everyone who's educated in China will be fully aware that Liu Xiaobo won the Nobel Peace Prize, even though that fact is one that they very vigorously block in China. The blocking doesn't prevent people from finding it out. It prevents people from having an open conversation about it. People just know that's the topic you don't talk about in your blog, you don't talk about it on social media. And so that does tend to work, and that's a more sophisticated approach to censorship than what we used to see, where it was all about trying to control what people knew about. At the same time, we know that through encryption, through good quality software design, people have many, many opportunities to speak privately using various kinds of social media. So people may not be openly, publicly blogging about something, but they'll be talking to their friends about it in private chats and things like that. That software needs to be super secure because otherwise those people are very vulnerable.
And I'm glad that you mentioned China, because I wanted to ask you a question specifically about China. Can you tell us a little bit about Wikipedia's current status in China? Do you have a sense of how many people are able to access it? And I believe I'd read somewhere a comment in which you said that you'd rather have no Wikipedia in China than a Wikipedia that complies with Chinese censorship. And that's a very interesting comment because US companies in general face a real challenge when they go to China. Do they comply with China's rules in the interest of having their service available in China, or do they become blocked entirely? So I guess my question for you is that, do you think that having no Wikipedia in China would lead to a greater absence of information? And why would you think such a trade-off is worth it?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the current status of Wikipedia in China, we are broadly accessible in China. There are a handful of pages that are blocked in China. So the kinds of things would be Liu Xiaobo, who I mentioned, Ai Weiwei, the artist, who's annoying the government, things about Tiananmen Square. Mostly it's the usual suspects. It's the things that are sensitive to the Chinese government that they will block and filter those pages. So at the present time, it seems unlikely that they will block all of Wikipedia, at least not without talking to us. We do have a channel of communication, and so I think they would raise some concern before they would block all of Wikipedia again. But for me, I think this idea that companies should bow down and participate in censorship in order to do business in China is a fatal mistake. I think in our case, Wikipedia is very popular in China, growing in popularity in China. It's not as popular as it is in most places around the world, simply because we were banned for about 3 years. But it would be very costly to the Chinese government to block Wikipedia. People use it for all the kinds of routine, ordinary things that people use it for. The Chinese government is interested in technological development, for example, and of course everybody knows who's in the technology space that there are new terms, new things that pop up all the time, and you go to Wikipedia to read and make sure you understand the USB standard or the latest programming frameworks. So it seems unlikely that they would really want to block all of Wikipedia, and so there's no reason for us to negotiate from a position of weakness. We can say, look, go ahead, block us. You're going to regret it. People are going to be very upset about it. At the same time, you can only go so far with that. They do continue to filter certain pages.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I mean, for people who follow the debate about U.S. companies in China, that's a really interesting point of view, because there are a lot of U.S. companies who, over the years, have taken a different stance on China and have decided that they would comply with Chinese censorship. So that's a really interesting perspective.
Sure. I mean, yeah, Google did for a while, but then they found it to be too painful, essentially, and so they pulled out. And Google is now broadly accessible in China, except for a few things, and this and that and the other. So, I think that there is a need to understand that their desire to filter certain political information is one of many desires that they have, and that actually access to the internet is also an important value for them.
Well, I think what's interesting, just as a side note, is that China does not really have its own version of Wikipedia that can compete with Wikipedia the way that it can. One of the ways that China has leverage over U.S. companies is that they have their own versions, their domestic versions that are very popular. So when the U.S. companies say, we don't want to comply with Chinese censorship, they say, well, we don't need you. But that's not the case with Wikipedia.
Well, I mean, they do have Baidu, which is a Chinese encyclopedia run by Baidu, the search engine. I would say actually one of the reasons why Wikipedia is not more popular in China is that Baidu, unlike most of the other search engines, really doesn't mind promoting their own properties, whether they're the best or not, in the search results. And so Baidu is actually quite popular in China. So they do, in a certain sense, have a competitor. It's not as good, of course. That's my biased opinion.
Thank you. Quickly, just one other country-specific example before we move on to broader questions. I also want to ask you about Russia, because Wikipedia has taken a stand against internet censorship in Russia specifically. And Russia is an interesting case because Russia does seem to be moving backwards on internet freedom. Not so long ago, Russia had a relatively free internet, and now we're seeing Russia cracking down in a lot of areas. So I guess my question is, do you think that this crackdown in Russia will be effective in silencing critics and in curbing free information? And just more generally, what do you think are the prospects for internet freedom in Russia?
Well, so it's a complicated question, of course, but the general principle that I said before definitely holds true in Russia. One of the pages that they have complained to us about is a page in Wikipedia which explains that people smoke marijuana. Well, it's an encyclopedia page. It's not advocating for smoking marijuana. It just explains that people do, and this is how they do it, and they use pipes, and they use papers, and whatever. It's fairly absurd for them to imagine that if they block this page, people will suddenly forget how to smoke marijuana. That's nonsense, of course. But what it does do for them is it has an impact on the domestic conversation. People don't feel free to speak openly about issues around drug use and so forth. And so there is a certain sense, if they're more sophisticated, in which they can have a big impact. And of course, for Russia, I would say at the present time, the real issues are not about marijuana and homosexual propaganda. That's another big thing they have. I think a deeper issue is about nationalism and about attempting to create a certain kind of a fervor within Russia to hold up what I see as a rapidly declining regime that's going to have a real problem in the next few years.
Well, I guess the larger question about Russia is that they're conducting this fascinating experiment, which is, you give the population a relatively free internet, and then you try to take it away. Do you think they will be successful in this effort?
I think they'll be partly successful for a while. But of course, people in Russia widely view this with mockery because it's silly and it's nonsense. And of course, things like saying you can't talk about homosexuality as an issue unless you're condemning it, it's so out of step with the modern world, including the modern Russian people's view of the world, that it opens them up to mockery. And in many ways, mockery is as powerful a force as protest, because once the emperor has no clothes, things can change very quickly.
Thank you so much. And what about the United States? What do you see as the status of internet freedom in the United States at the moment, and what are the biggest challenges to freedom of information in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, the U.S. is quite fortunate because the First Amendment is quite strong. There's a very, very strong history of Supreme Court jurisprudence around that. So I don't consider it to be a place with enormous problems around freedom of expression. I would say the bigger problems in the U.S. is an unfortunate news media environment that's become quite soundbite oriented and so forth. But that's not really a legal or rights issue. It's more of a cultural issue, I would say.
Yeah, and one of the things that we saw with Wikipedia specifically, with the protests against SOPA, for example, we saw that ordinary citizens can make a difference if they band together and they fight for change. Do you think that the American cloud and hosting industry is sufficiently engaged in the battle for internet freedom, or are you concerned about issues of public apathy?
Well, I mean, I would say the biggest issue facing the U.S. cloud industry is also the biggest threat, in a sense, for free expression, which is the concerns that people quite rightly have after all the revelations of the last few years about mass surveillance programs. If you are a company in Germany, you should be very concerned about this, that if the U.S. government is engaging in mass surveillance, which, by the way, they have evidently used in trade negotiations, you're going to say, you know what, actually, I'm not so sure that I really want all my company data to be available simply because we chose to work with a U.S. cloud providing company. I think we'll go with the domestic company here in Germany. And that's a big threat, and it's something that we should all consider, that one of the things the U.S. should be in this modern world is a safe haven for people's privacy and data security and things like this. And to the extent that the NSA and the government is undermining security, obviously we're going to lose business to places overseas.
And what do you think the U.S. could do to reassure people? I mean, you're right, this is a big issue, that people have lost trust in the U.S. It is as a safe haven, and is there anything that the U.S. could do to repair that impression?
Well, I mean, I think that we need to have some serious reform of the intelligence gathering activities. I would start with a greater level of transparency. There's no question that it is legitimate to some extent to have surveillance. I mean, for me, it's really all about probable cause and getting a warrant and those kinds of things. But what's really bothered a lot of people is that we haven't had a proper public debate about it. We haven't had a serious examination. And also, of course, we've got a problem with politicians who don't really have a deep understanding of the technology, being led by the intelligence services who have an agenda that may not be consistent with our democratic values.
Thank you. So just to go on to some more specific industry questions. So Wikipedia and services like that tend to be large central content platforms where users work on subsections according to their interests. There are also open source wiki tools like Wikimedia. Is there a role for hosting providers in supporting smaller installations of these tools?
Yeah, sure, definitely. I mean, my for-profit company, Wikia, hosts a few 100,000 smaller communities on all kinds of topics. The most popular ones are typically pop culture, so things like the Game of Thrones wiki and so forth, but we host wikis for all kinds of tiny communities of special interest. So, and it's great because the software is open source. It's quite easy for people to use us or use another provider.
Great, thank you. And how should hosting providers think about the relationship between infrastructure and content?
Well, I think it varies depending on the specific type of service that we're talking about. I mean, one of the ways to look at the question is to think about infrastructure, not in the sense of the hardware per se, but the software and the software tools that you provide people does have a major impact on the nature of the content. You know, we see Twitter struggling often with problems of harassment and cyberbullying, in part because they haven't fully developed the tools that they need for people to be able to control their own environment. Similarly, one of my favorites to look at is the comment fields at most newspapers are just dreadful, dreadful places, simply because anybody can come and post anything. Right. There's no real moderation. There's no real sense of community. It's just random idiots yelling at each other. That's a problem that's caused in large part by software design, software that's not designed in a way that will give the community of readers real control over that environment.
And many traditional hosting providers now offer tools for integrating websites with social media like Facebook and Twitter. Are there opportunities for integration between traditional web hosting services and large centralized publishing platforms?
I mean, sure, yeah. I mean, I think that this is still an ongoing trend that, you know, people are building web presences of various kinds. I mean, back in the old days, if you wanted to set up a website as an individual, you would learn HTML and start making HTML pages. And then we went through this long period of transition towards increasing levels of disassociated web services. So now you might have a blog, but in your blog, you'll also have your Facebook feed and your Twitter feed and things like this. So this kind of integration of various tools from many different providers is still an ongoing trend, and this includes mobile and so forth.
And a larger question about disruption. You know, we talk a lot about the ubiquity of smartphones and how this is disrupting all sorts of things. And what kinds of internet-caused disruptions do you see as affecting the cloud and hosting industry?
Well, I mean, there's so many things going on, it's difficult to keep track. So, you know, with mobile devices, we are seeing now an enormous explosion of apps, an enormous explosion of data, an enormous explosion of people's demand for data services. You know, in the old days, you would take a picture with your digital camera, and then you would go home and you would plug it into your computer and load it into your computer, and maybe you would back it up somewhere. Now, at least on my phone, everything gets backed up to Dropbox and I think Google and I don't know, maybe somewhere else as well, automatically. So this means that the demand for these kinds of cloud services is really skyrocketing, in part driven by mobile, because there's so much more data that people are generating and want to have accessible to them in various ways.
And just kind of zooming back again to the larger internet freedom question. So earlier you expressed, I think, what could maybe be categorized as optimism about, you know, the state of internet freedom, in the sense that, you know, governments are cracking down, but people are still finding ways, and that no government can completely control the flow of information. What do you see, just in a macro sense, what do you see as some of the biggest threats to internet freedom today on a global scale? I mean, is it censorship, surveillance? Is it public apathy? I mean, what do you see as some of the major forces that are really threatening freedom of the internet?
Well, I mean, I think all of those things that you just mentioned have, to some extent, a common root. And the common root is a lack of education amongst well-meaning policymakers. So we can think about the policymakers who are actually up to no good. That's one category. But one of the problems we have is that a lot of policymakers just don't understand technology at all. Not long ago, we had a statement by David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the UK, that he was opposed in that there could be software where even in principle it was impossible for the government to have access to communications. Well, that's encryption and that's mathematics, and you're not going to ban encryption. It's completely impossible. So as a policy statement, we may be offended by the idea, but it doesn't matter because he's put forward a proposal that is absolutely technologically incoherent. And that's problematic because if you want to have a nuanced and thoughtful conversation with politicians about the balance between privacy and security, about the legitimate needs of law enforcement, is very hard to have with people who don't even know what they're talking about. And so I think we should really focus hard, all of us as citizens, about getting educated about encryption, getting educated about software. And I don't mean that you need to become a mathematician. You just need to understand the general principles behind it, and make sure that you look for politicians who seem to have some actual understanding of the internet, because otherwise we're just going to continue to get silly proposals and bad laws.
Yeah, well, it's actually really interesting that you mentioned that specific example, because it does seem that technological lack of knowledge is part of the problem. But I think there's another interesting trend happening, at least in democratic governments. So, I just wrote a book about how authoritarian governments try to control the web. But what we're seeing is in democracies as well, democracies like to talk about freedom of the internet, but then once they feel that internet freedom might threaten national security, they start singing a different tune, right? So we're starting to see more examples like that of leaders of democratic countries also saying things that are not positive about internet freedom, or who suggest that, yeah, we love internet freedom, but not if it's going to cause a riot here, and not if it's going to cause a protest here. And I think the example that you just said, the example you just gave illustrates that quite well. So do you see that trend happening in democratic countries as well, where we're starting to see leaders be more worried about the internet affecting security at home?
I mean, it's hard to see what the overall trend is. I mean, this is nothing new. Certainly since 9/11, which is quite some time ago now, there have been these kinds of concerns raised, and often somewhat incoherently. Yes, we do see it. I'm not sure we're seeing it more than we used to see it, but it is something to be vigilant about.
Definitely. So some other larger questions here. So this is a question that I think you probably get asked a lot, but I'm sure some people are still curious about it. You've joked that donating Wikipedia to the foundation was the dumbest and the smartest thing that you had ever done. And you gave away billions of dollars, which I think people find intriguing. And do you still think it was the right decision, or do you sometimes think, I wish I had those billions of dollars?
Oh, no, it was absolutely the right decision. I mean, Wikipedia is something historic. To have been a part of Wikipedia, to be a member of this fantastic community who's given this great gift to the world, it's incredibly meaningful. And, Wikipedia is what it is today in large part because it is a nonprofit organization, which allows us the intellectual independence, the financial independence to be able to pursue our values with some clarity that might be a lot harder to do if we had different kinds of pressures on us to meet quarterly results and that sort of thing.
Oh, that's an interesting. Yeah, so you think that it would have actually affected the independence of Wikipedia, having more of a finance?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good
Sure, sure. Yeah, definitely.
This is kind of a funny question, but I'd be curious what you think. Thinking of, when we think about all the knowledge that has been lost over the centuries, is there one article that you wish the Wikipedia community would write?
Yeah, I mean, I read this question beforehand and I reflected on it quite a bit, and I actually couldn't think of one single thing. I mean, the truth is, almost anything you can think of, the Wikipedia community has already written about it. So we're very, very comprehensive in what we cover. Obviously, there are a lot of things that are lost to us forever in history. So I think it would be wonderful if we could magically have a Wikipedia entry about, daily life in prehistorical times, about which we know very little other than what we know from archaeology, which is just scraps of information here and there. But yeah, it's just not possible, I'm afraid.
So speaking about things that have been lost, we look at Wikipedia's competitors, if you can call it that, right? So the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is no longer in print, or discontinued printing rather, or the Encyclopedia Americana. Do you feel that you have killed in some ways, or helped contribute to the death of some of these printed, predecessors?
Well, I mean, yes, obviously we have, although it's worth noting that Britannica was already under a great deal of pressure from the digital age more broadly, even before the internet. Right. Microsoft Encarta was quite a threat to their pre-existing business model. But yeah, obviously we're part of a major change that's going on in society, and definitely, yeah.
And how do you feel about that? Do you ever feel sad about the death of this printed matter, or do you just see this as part of the natural course of history?
I mean, actually, I think I can feel both. You know, I think it is a natural part of the course of history, but I also can feel a bit of nostalgia about beautiful leather-bound books and, you know, gorgeous old libraries and things like that.
And so I guess the next question would be looking forward, you know, the next steps for Wikipedia. What do you think, or what are the kind of innovations that you see is the next step for online encyclopedias? What will be the next innovation, the next major innovation? What will be the next revolution, or what will it look like?
Well, so I would point at two things that I think are critical. So first, our editing environment is currently still a bit old-fashioned. When you click edit, you get Wiki markup language. We're moving in the direction of a visual editor. We've just recently ramped up our investment in that. And the reason for that is we want Wikipedia to be accessible to participation from everybody, not just computer geeks. And so that's an important shift that's coming in the next few years. The other thing I point to is the growth of Wikipedia in the languages of the developing world and all that goes along with that. The next billion people are going to be coming online in the next 5 to 10 years, and they're going to come online for the most part on mobile devices, and that has an impact on Wikipedia and how people use it and so forth. So I think those are the two major shifts that I would see coming.
Thank you. So switching gears a little bit, recently you took a strategic stake in the business of the mobile network, the People's Operator, TPO. Can you tell us a bit about this project?
Yeah, sure. So the People's Operator is a mobile phone company currently based in the UK, but we launch in the US in the next few weeks. And the premise of the company is that 10% of your bill goes to the cause of your choice. 25% of the company's profits go to charity. Our prices are a good deal in the marketplace. So how do we afford that? And the answer is we do away with the marketing budget for the most part. So no TV commercials, no magazine ads, billboards, et cetera, and mailings, all the things that they spend huge amounts of money on, we eliminate, and we just ask people to tell their friends and to use the tools that I'm building to share it with other people.
And so 25% of the company's post-tax profit goes to causes. Can you tell us just a little bit more about some of the specific projects that you're supporting?
Well, as of yet, we're a small and very rapidly growing company, so we don't have any profits. So we've set up the TPO Foundation, which will receive that money. And it's an independent foundation with an independent board of directors. I understand they've chosen youth and education as their first theme. But until we actually make some money to send to them, that piece of this whole operation is going to be pretty limited. But the 10% happens immediately. That doesn't wait for us to make money. That's straight out of your bill.
And so apparently TPO is planning a global expansion. And when will you start business in the States, and what are your expectations?
Yeah, so we launch in the next few weeks in the US. We'll also be launching our social platform, which I think is going to be quite exciting. It's a platform so that people can come, much like Kickstarter, you can start a campaign, you can begin to raise money for whatever cause you're interested in. Yeah, we think it's going to be pretty cool. After that, we're not sure where we're going to go yet, but the concept and the model is completely global in scope. And so we, unlike, you know, everything I do is global in scope, but when it's a pure internet play, you just start global from day one. In this case, because the mobile providers are country by country by country, we need to go in and make a deal with the local provider to be, you know, a part of their network. So it's going to take a little while to launch in other countries, but yeah, we're very ambitious. And
we have another question here, sort of about you personally. Time magazine named you on its 2006 list of the 100 most influential people in the world. And I guess sort of a big question, but you know, what do you think about your own personal influence on the world, and what are some of the what is some of the influence that you hope to have in the future that you continue to your personal influence that you would hope to see in the future?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I find that I have a certain kind of public voice on certain issues. So issues relating to internet freedom and freedom of expression are things where I'm able to bring a focus to. So I'm just have recently launched my personal foundation, the Jimmy Wales Foundation, which is Jimmy Wales Foundation for Freedom of Expression. And what we're focusing on is how can I amplify my voice? How can we have impact? How can I focus attention on various cases of suppression of speech and oppression in various places around the world, with a particular focus on internet expression. So bloggers and people on Twitter who are being targeted by their governments. So I'm pretty excited about that. I've often been asked by people, oh, look, there's this problem here in whatever country, Azerbaijan, there's this blogger who's been arrested, can you help us? And unfortunately, I feel very guilty sometimes because I just don't have time to deal with all of these kinds of things. Now I've got a little bit of money behind it. I'm trying to raise some more money for it, but I want to be able to have some staff so that we can actually draw some light onto some of these cases, which unfortunately get lost in the global media storm.
Definitely, definitely. And I guess thinking, this is another kind of interesting question. Is there a moment when you personally realized that Wikipedia was a game changer, that this was really shaking things up? Was there a particular incident, or I don't know, a particular entry, or any moment where you kind of thought, okay, things are not going to be the same from now on?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple. So first of all, the previous project, Nupedia, had the same vision, free encyclopedia for everyone on the planet in their own language, but had a very top-down model. It wasn't working very well. And then when we launched the Wiki software, we had more work done in 2 weeks than in almost 2 years. So that was a moment when I said, this is actually pretty interesting. And then later, it was actually September 11th, 2001, when you turned on television and you saw the talking heads speculating about this and that, and you saw the video of the planes flying into the buildings over and over, and nobody knew very much. And I went on Wikipedia, and the community was working on all kinds of background information. So we had, people writing the history of the World Trade Center buildings, all the airlines that were involved that day, this, that, and the other various terrorist groups who were possibly implicated. And so I saw the community coming together and filling a certain spot in the media that had been missing before, which was to cover the background story. And I thought, oh, that's a game changer. That's really interesting. Of course, we see this today. Anytime there's a major global emergency or crisis, you'll see on Wikipedia people working very hard to fill in the entries about what's happened, about the local people, the villages, whatever might be involved. And so we still see that today, that we play a certain role in basic background knowledge.
So that's an interesting question. That also comes back to this larger question on, what is the ultimate impact of increased information, right? So in the past, however long ago, information was relatively guarded by a select group of people or controlled by a group of people. And in the era of Wikipedia, everybody has access to this information. Everybody can edit this information. Then when you move into more controlled environments, like some of the ones we spoke about earlier, that information is circumscribed. But I guess the question is when you have a country with an authoritarian government that has very strong controls over assembly and over political dissent, what is the role of information in those countries, right? Because this is kind of a debate. It's like, okay, so yes, you can go onto Wikipedia and get information in a limited form, but what can you do with that information? And what is do you understand my question? Like, how would the information, what is the impact that information will ultimately have on these more controlled environments?
Yeah, I mean, so the way I look at this kind of question is there's a very real sense in which we have Twitter revolutions, Facebook revolutions. That's a real phenomenon, that people are able now to use the internet and social media as a tool to organize protests against oppressive governments. And there's been some positive things and obviously some things that have been disappointing in terms of how they worked out. But I always say there's a point when you go out in the street and you demand, as they did in Tunisia, that the dictator leave the country, and then he does, and that's a great thing. But then there's the longer, harder, more complicated process of building civil society, of building institutions that protect your democratic liberties. And that involves a lot about education, a lot about understanding, about comparative research into different government institutions. And the more informed and the more educated a populace we have around the world, the more able people are to begin to move in the direction of designing institutions that will really matter in terms of holding onto whatever liberty they're able to get by going out in the streets and protesting. That's obviously a much more subtle effect, but I think in many ways it's a very, very powerful effect.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of phrasing it. It's the idea that information in and of itself is not enough to create a successful revolution, but it's kind of a necessary prerequisite for building a more informed society.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if we want to start taking Twitter questions around now, if we have any questions from the audience. Okay. Let's see. Okay. All right, so we have a question for by Juan Carlos. Jimmy, do you think that Wikipedia started a model for anarchy worldwide? And that's at JUCALDER.
I didn't hear the.
I was just
you were
giving
just
you
spelling something?
No, sorry, I was just giving the Twitter handle. The question is, Jimmy, do you think that Wikipedia started a model for anarchy worldwide?
Yeah, well, I mean, Wikipedia is definitely not an anarchy. Wikipedia is a very complex social structure with elements of consensus, democracy, aristocracy, monarchy. It's a curious mix, Wikipedia, but it's anything but an anarchy. It's definitely not in any way anarchical. It's not a place where there's no rules. It's not a place where people can come and do whatever they like. So I don't think we've started a trend towards anarchy, no.
Thank you. Here's a question from Chris Mondini from ICANN. What do you think of plans for free but limited internet access in the developing world?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, there's, for me, one of the most important humanitarian things we can do is get people access to information. And obviously, we want to get it to people with as little cost as possible, because otherwise it isn't really access. If you say, oh, it's available, but at a price you can't afford. And so there's an interesting set of negotiations about how do we persuade the service providers, i.e. the mobile phone networks, to make some of the essential services available for free. And I'm all for that. Obviously, some people have concerns about what does this mean about net neutrality? What does this mean about, you know, the future of the internet? And I think we should be vigilant about those questions for sure. But I think that there are many competing values here, and we have to take a nuanced and thoughtful approach.
Great, thank you. One more, this is from John Zani. How should a business think about what data should be part of the public knowledge versus what should be private?
Well, that's a fantastic question, and obviously it's a very broad question, and so the specific answers will depend on the specific business, the specific industry, the specific competitive landscape, and so forth. But in general, I think we can draw some broad principles, which is to say that openness is more powerful than it used to be, and it becomes really interesting the more open your business is with your customers, with your partners. There's a lot more opportunities for genuine collaboration, of co-creating products, et cetera, et cetera. And so oftentimes, you know, I find secrecy is massively overrated. Certainly in all of my work, I tend to be very, very public about what I'm doing. And people say, oh, but if you give away what you're doing before you do it, then other people will do it first and so on. But I mean, generally that doesn't happen. So that doesn't mean that I'm advocating that every business should stop having any secrets. Obviously, it does depend on the context. But I always encourage people to think about information you're keeping really close held within the company. It actually might be more valuable to share that with your customers, with your partners. You might actually get more back from that than what you're getting from keeping it secret.
Thank you so much. So I think those are all for our public questions, unless anybody has a last-minute question that they want to submit by Twitter right this second. But thank you so much. That was really insightful. Is there anything else that we didn't get to that you'd like to add, or any closing comments that you'd like to make?
No, it's great. Thanks so much for having me here, and I hope everybody's enjoying the conference. And yeah, well, edit Wikipedia, please. We need help.
Thank you, and thank you so much for answering such a broad range of questions with so much insight. I really appreciate it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.